The chickens were screaming. Marjorie Bennet bolted upright in her bed, heart pounding against her ribs like something alive and trying to get out. It wasn't the usual fuss, not the squabble over a roosting spot or the occasional raccoon scratching at the wire. This was sharp, panicked, primal. She grabbed the old flashlight off the nightstand, shoved her feet into slippers, and reached for the .22 rifle leaning behind the kitchen door. It hadn't been fired since the winter of '08, but it was loaded. James had made sure of that, back when he was still breathing and suspicious of everything that moved after midnight. The porch floor groaned under her steps. Cool September air swept through her nightgown and made her knees ache. Out beyond the fence, the henhouse lantern swung on its hook, casting frantic shadows. Something moved behind the coop, low to the ground, quick. She raised the rifle. "Whoever you are," she said, voice steady but hoarse, "this is not the yard you want to die in tonight." No answer. Then came the voice, trembling and young. "Senora, please." The flashlight's beam fell on him. A boy, maybe 16, 17, crouched behind the water barrel, holding his side, blood seeping between his fingers. His hair was plastered to his forehead, face streaked with sweat and mud. The whites of his eyes gleamed like bone in the dark. He didn't run, didn't even flinch. I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his English heavy with something southern and broken. I didn't know where else to go." Marjorie's grip on the rifle tightened, but her arms felt suddenly heavy. "What the hell are you doing bleeding on my chickens?" she asked, more to slow the panic rising in her chest than to get an answer. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and leaned hard against the barrel. "Please," he said again. "Just one night?" She stared at him, the flashlight beam shaking slightly in her hand. For a moment, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like something washed ashore, battered, scared, half drowned in a world that hadn't been kind. James would have called the sheriff by now. Hell, James would have aimed first. But James was gone, and the world had moved on without asking her permission. Marjorie lowered the rifle. "You'll freeze to death before morning." She turned, walking back toward the house. After 3 steps, she glanced over her shoulder. "Well?" she barked. "You coming, or am I talking to my damned chickens?" She made him sit on a stool by the back door while she fetched towels and the first aid kit. He didn't say much, didn't ask her name, didn't complain when she poured hydrogen peroxide into the open cut along his ribs, just hissed and gripped the counter with both hands like he was trying not to vanish. "You got a name?" she asked, dabbing iodine gently over the wound. He nodded. "Luis." "Just Luis?" He shrugged. "Just Luis." Marjorie didn't press. She wrapped the bandage tight, noting how thin his body was, skin stretched over bone, like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. "You run from something?" He hesitated. Then, "Someone." She nodded once and stood. "You'll sleep in the pantry. Don't touch the preserves, and don't try anything stupid. I might be old, but I shoot straight." Luis managed a faint smile. "Yes, ma'am." Later, Marjorie lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and settled around her like it always did. But the quiet felt different now, like it was holding its breath. She thought of the boy's face. The blood. That voice in the dark calling her Senora, like she was someone who could help. She had spent the last decade keeping people out. Closing doors, drawing blinds, not attending church, not answering the phone. Even the mailman learned to leave things at the gate. Grief had carved her into something still and silent. But now there was a stranger in her pantry, and he had bled on her towels. James would be rolling in his grave, or maybe he would have understood. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the kitchen window in thin, golden lines. Marjorie cracked 2 eggs into a cast-iron skillet and fried them beside a ladle of leftover grits. She placed the plate on the table with a dull clink and called, "Luis!" He emerged slowly, blinking in the light, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "Sit," she said, pouring weak coffee into a chipped mug. He obeyed. They ate in silence, not awkward, just careful, like 2 animals sniffing around each other's scent, waiting to see if the other would bite. Luis didn't eat fast, but he didn't waste a single crumb either. When he finished, he looked up. "Thank you." She nodded and poured him another half cup. "That wound'll need changing tonight," she said. "And if you're staying, just for a night, mind you, you're helping with chores." He blinked. "Yes, ma'am." That afternoon, Luis raked fallen leaves under the magnolia tree while Marjorie watched from the porch. Her chair creaked gently beneath her, and the breeze smelled like sun-warmed pine. The boy moved slow, cautious. He didn't ask questions, didn't wander far from the yard. But every now and then he'd glance toward her, not out of fear, she noticed, but out of something closer to reverence, like he still couldn't believe he hadn't been turned away. Marjorie sipped her coffee, gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe the sheriff would hear something. Maybe someone would come looking for Luis. But for now, the porch was full again. Not with answers, just with breath, with movement. And in the quiet between leaf piles and creaking floorboards, something she hadn't felt in years began to stir. Something old, soft, and stubborn. Something that almost felt like purpose. The mornings settled into a rhythm, quiet and strangely comforting. Marjorie woke before the sun, just as she always had, and brewed her weak coffee, letting it simmer on the stove as the old floorboards creaked awake beneath her feet. She no longer walked the house alone. Though Luis rarely made a sound, she could sense his presence now. Soft movements from the pantry, the occasional shuffle of blankets, the quiet clearing of a throat. They didn't talk much, not yet, and she didn't ask him to. On the 3rd morning, she found him outside before dawn, standing near the magnolia tree with his hands in his pockets, staring up at the heavy branches. His hair was damp from the dew, and his breath showed in small puffs in the chilly air. "You're up early," she said, stepping down onto the porch. He turned, startled, then nodded. "Didn't sleep much." Marjorie wrapped her cardigan tighter around her chest. "That tree's been here longer than this house. James planted it our first spring here. Said if it grew, we'd stay. We stayed." Luis looked back at the tree, then down at the rake resting by his feet. "I can clean the yard again, if you want." She hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Fine. But don't stir up the dirt too close to the roots. That tree's older than you and me both." He offered a small smile. "Yes, ma'am." Later that day she watched from the porch as he worked. He moved slower now, his side still stiff from the wound, but he worked with quiet care. No wasted effort, no complaints. He didn't act like someone hiding. He acted like someone trying to make himself small, invisible, but useful. She knew that feeling too well. Inside the house, she opened the drawer where James kept his pocket knife and keys. Tucked beneath a pile of old receipts was a small photo, black and white, sun-faded. James, in uniform, standing stiff next to a tank, a ghost of a smile on his lips. She touched the edge of the frame. He hadn't liked strangers, said they brought trouble with them. But what had his war ever taught him besides how to build walls and live inside them? She closed the drawer and sighed. Luis ate dinner at the table now, though still in silence. That night she made vegetable soup and cornbread. He chewed slowly, carefully, like he didn't want to take more than he deserved. She poured them each a glass of water, then sat opposite him with a slice of cornbread buttered at the edges. Halfway through the meal, he looked up and spoke softly. "You live here alone?" She nodded. "Since James passed." "How long?" 10 years. He swallowed hard, looked down. You ever get lonely? She didn't answer right away. The word felt too small for the kind of silence she'd been living in. Some days, she said at last, some days it feels like the world forgot I'm still here. Other days I try to forget it back. Luis nodded like he understood more than a boy his age should. Back home, my mother used to say people are like wells, some deep, some dry, some poisoned, but you never know which until you drink. That right? Marjorie raised an eyebrow. She said, if someone offers you kindness without asking, it means their well still has water. Not many left like that. She looked at him then. Not the wound, not the dirt on his collar, but the way his eyes didn't flinch, the way he held himself, not like a boy, but like someone who'd learned too young how to survive. Your mother sounds like she was smart. Luis gave a tiny nod. She didn't make it across the desert. The silence returned, heavier this time. Later that evening, Marjorie sat on the porch with a blanket around her knees, staring at the road while Luis read an old National Geographic by lamplight. He'd found it on the bookshelf beside the sewing machine and asked if he could borrow it. Help yourself, she'd said. That thing's been collecting dust longer than you've been alive. The dogs barked once, then fell quiet again. The night air was sharp, full of the kind of stillness that made her bones ache. Do you miss your family? She asked, not turning around. Luis was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, but I think I miss the idea of them more than the people now. I remember things that feel soft, even if they weren't. Marjorie nodded slowly. Memory has a way of polishing what never shined in the first place. A long pause stretched between them, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. You ever have kids? Luis asked quietly. No, she said. Tried once. It didn't stick. He didn't say sorry, just looked back at the magazine. I always wanted a granddaughter, she added after a moment. Someone to cook for, complain about the weather to. Someone who might stay long enough to notice when the light changes in the evening. Luis smiled without lifting his head. Guess I'll have to get better at sweeping porches. She chuckled softly, the sound surprising even to herself. That night, she left a folded towel and a clean shirt on the stool outside the pantry door. He never thanked her directly, but the next morning he was wearing the shirt and had swept the kitchen without being asked. By the end of the week, the rhythm between them had settled into something unspoken and warm. She brewed the coffee. He gathered the eggs. She read the obituaries. He raked the leaves. And neither of them talked about what came next. But on the 7th day, Marjorie saw a car she didn't recognize slow down near her fence. It didn't stop. Just crept along, windows tinted, before rolling away again down the road. She stood there long after it disappeared, heart ticking louder than it should have. When she came back inside, Luis was washing dishes, his sleeves rolled up, humming low to himself. Everything okay? He asked. Marjorie forced a smile. Yeah, just thinking. But later that night, while he was asleep, she double-checked the locks and pulled James's old revolver from the drawer. She cleaned it slowly, deliberately, then placed it under the pillow beside her bed. She didn't know who was looking for the boy, but she knew now she wouldn't let them take him easy. Not while she still had water left in her well, and not while he still needed a place to be safe. Not yet. Not like this. The next morning broke colder than the last. A thin frost clung to the porch railings, making the boards slick beneath Marjorie's slippers. She wrapped herself tighter in James's old flannel and sipped her coffee slowly, her eyes fixed on the gravel road beyond the magnolia tree. The memory of the strange car from the day before still pressed against her mind like a bruise she couldn't stop touching. Luis came out a few minutes later, arms crossed over his chest, teeth chattering slightly in the morning air. He nodded at her and sat on the steps without a word. The quiet between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was familiar now, like music they both knew how to hum. She handed him the second mug she'd poured. "Figured you'd want something warm before you freeze solid." He took it with both hands. "Thank you." They sat that way for a while, drinking in silence, their breath mingling in pale clouds. Then Luis broke the quiet. "There was a car yesterday." Marjorie didn't flinch. "You saw it?" He nodded. "Tinted windows? Drove slow? Didn't stop?" She lowered her mug and let the steam rise into her face. "I figured it was nothing," he said carefully. "But I've seen cars like that before, when we were in Texas, before my uncle disappeared." Marjorie studied his face. There was no panic in his voice, but his eyes were different, focused, calculating. "You think someone's looking for you?" Luis nodded slowly. "Yes, but not police. Something else. Men who work between things. Not quite law, not quite criminals. People who get paid to return missing property. Or people." "Bounty hunters?" she asked. He shrugged. "Or worse. Some men don't ask for proof. They just follow a whisper." Marjorie leaned back in her chair and let that sit with her. Her grip on the mug tightened. "Well," she said after a moment, "if they come back, they'll find the gate locked and a shotgun waiting." Luis didn't smile. "They don't knock, Marjorie." That was the first time he'd said her name. Later that day, she pulled the old photo albums from the hallway closet, the ones she hadn't opened in years. Dust coated the covers, and the pages inside smelled like cedar and thyme. She sat at the dining table with a cup of tea and flipped slowly through the memories. Luis walked in, towel draped over his shoulder from scrubbing the porch rail. He paused when he saw her. "You look different," he said softly. "I used to smile more," she replied, without looking up. "Didn't mean I was happier." He stepped closer, peering at the page. One photograph showed her younger self on the same porch, standing beside a man with sharp features and a military buzz cut, James. Her hand was resting on his shoulder, but the look in her eyes was distant, even then. "That him?" Luis asked. She nodded. "That's James. He hated cameras, said they made people pretend." Luis pointed at another photo, a grainy image of James in uniform, standing in a desert, arm around a local boy. "Who's that?" "Somewhere in Iraq," she said. "That kid brought water to their base every day. James said he reminded him of his brother when they were boys." Luis looked at her carefully. "Did James like people like me?" Marjorie closed the album. "No," she said plainly. "Not really. He came back from war with more ghosts than medals, started believing the world was simpler than it was, that there were good people and bad ones, and people like you weren't on the good side." Luis didn't answer, just nodded, like he'd heard that before. She reached across the table and tapped her fingers once on the wood. "He wasn't always that way," she said. "Once, he brought home a stray dog from the gas station and let it sleep in our bed, cried like a child when it died." Luis offered the smallest of smiles. "People are complicated." "Yeah," she whispered. "We are." That evening, they sat by the fire, her in the old rocking chair, him on the rug with a book of poetry he'd found in the back room. Marjorie watched him read, watched his lips move silently with the words. He was learning faster than she expected. There was hunger in him, for knowledge, for language, for a place to belong. She stirred the coals with a fire poker. "If I had a child, I think they'd be about your age now, maybe a little older." Luis looked up. "You wanted children?" "I did," she said. "But life didn't want me to have them. We tried. We even thought about adoption once, but James got nervous, said he couldn't raise a child who didn't look like him." Luis looked back at the fire. "You're not him," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. I'm not. A knock at the door made them both freeze. 3 slow raps. Marjorie stood, her knees popping, and moved to the door. She didn't open it, just cracked the curtain. It was Sheriff Joe Prescott, his pickup parked behind him, dust still settling from the gravel road. He rocked on his heels, hat in hand. She opened the door just enough. "Evening, Joe." "Marjorie," he said, nodding. "Mind if I step in?" "I do, actually." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Got word there's been someone sneaking around your property. Neighbors said they saw a boy. Maybe Mexican, maybe something else. You seen anything?" She held his gaze. "You know I don't keep company." Joe leaned slightly to the side, trying to peek past her into the house. "Mind if I look around?" "I do." "You got something to hide?" "I got floors I don't want your boots on." Joe shifted his weight, chewed his lip. "You sure, Marjorie? This could be serious. Word is, this kid's dangerous. Might have come through the valley last week. Group of 'em broke into a ranch down near Brookside. I'll let you know if any goats go missing." Joe sighed. "You always were stubborn. And you always were nosy." After a long moment, he tipped his hat. "Take care of yourself now. These are strange times." She closed the door without replying. Luis emerged from the pantry a minute later, his face pale, his hands clenched. "He'll come back," he said. "I know. What if he brings others?" She paused, then crossed the room and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the sun was setting fast, pulling shadows across the porch like long fingers. Inside, the fire crackled low and steady. And in that warmth, for the first time since Luis arrived, Marjorie didn't feel like a woman waiting to die. She felt like someone with something left to protect. The next few days passed in a tight, watchful silence. Marjorie moved through her routines like always, feeding the chickens, steeping tea, sweeping the porch, but her eyes were sharper, ears tuned to every sound beyond the fence line. She caught herself looking down the road more often, expecting the dust trail of Sheriff Prescott's truck or something worse. Luis seemed to sense the shift too. He stayed closer to the house, spoke less, and moved like someone bracing for a blow that hadn't landed yet. The fire in him, the quiet humor, the soft curiosity, hadn't vanished, but it dimmed. One morning, Marjorie found him outside before dawn again, kneeling by the magnolia tree, his fingers tracing something in the dirt. She watched from the porch, arms folded across her chest, not wanting to interrupt. But after a minute, curiosity pulled her down the steps. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable. "What is it?" she asked. Luis moved aside, revealing the symbol he'd drawn in the soil, a small sun with rays, a line beneath it that curved like a horizon, and beneath that a shape that looked like 2 hands pressed together. "My mother taught it to me," he said softly. "It's from our village. Means safe journey or go with blessing." Marjorie studied the drawing. "You planning to leave?" Luis hesitated. "I think I'll have to. Don't want to bring trouble here." She let out a slow breath and looked away toward the fields. "Trouble's already sniffing around, boy." "Whether you stay or go." Luis rubbed the dirt between his fingers. "I never thought I'd stay this long. I've run most of my life." "And how's that been working out for you?" He didn't answer. She knelt beside him with a grunt, her knees stiff. "Let me show you something." They walked together to the old shed near the barn, the one Marjorie rarely entered. Dust clung to every surface. Cobwebs stretched like threads of memory from the rafters. She reached up to a high shelf and pulled down a long, flat tin box. Inside were papers, yellowed, creased, some water-stained. She handed him one. It was a photo, black and white, of 2 children sitting on a fence rail, one of them clearly Marjorie as a girl, the other a boy with dark skin and wild curls. "His name was Reggie," she said. "My best friend. Lived down the road when we were little. We played every day until I turned 11, and Daddy told me I couldn't see him anymore. Said the world wouldn't understand. Said people would talk. Louise studied the picture carefully. I didn't listen. Snuck out for months just to sit by the creek and talk with him. Then one day, he was gone. No goodbye. No nothing. His family moved in the night. She replaced the photo, her voice steady but hollow. I don't know where he went, but I think about him more than most people who stayed. Louise looked at her with something close to awe. You could have turned me in, he said. I could have, she replied. Still might, he smiled. But until then, she added, you help me fix this fence before it falls down and lets the goats eat my roses. They spent the rest of the morning hammering in silence, side by side, sweat pooling beneath their collars despite the chill. Later that night, Marjorie cooked pinto beans with onion and cornbread on the skillet. Louise washed dishes without being asked. She watched him from the kitchen table, the flicker of the oil lamp painting shadows across his face. I was thinking, she said finally, you ever consider going to school? Louise paused mid-scrub. Here? Anywhere. I don't have papers. Papers don't make you smart. They just make other people comfortable. He glanced over his shoulder. You think I could? She nodded. If we find the right people, there's a pastor down in Dawsonville. Might know somebody. Louise was quiet a moment. You'd help me? She sipped her tea. I already have, haven't I? The knock came just before midnight. Not a loud one, not frantic, but deliberate. 3 short raps. Louise froze at the table. Marjorie stood slowly, every muscle in her back tightening. She peeked through the front curtain. 2 men stood at the gate, silhouetted in the moonlight. Not Prescott. These men were leaner, sharper, one of them wearing a military-style jacket. They didn't move, didn't call out. Marjorie stepped back from the window. Not the sheriff. Louise's voice was a whisper. Bounty? I don't know, she said. But they're not friends. He stood, already moving toward the back door. No, she said sharply. We don't run tonight. Louise looked at her, confused. What do we do? We listen. They waited. Minutes passed. Another knock. This time it came from the side of the house. They're circling, Louise muttered. Marjorie opened the drawer and pulled out the revolver. I want you in the pantry. Don't open the door, unless I say. Louise hesitated, then disappeared without a word. She turned down the lamp, casting the room into dim orange, then stepped out onto the porch, revolver hidden behind her coat. The men stood at the edge of the yard now. One called out, Evening, ma'am. We're looking for someone. Thought maybe you'd seen him. Marjorie narrowed her eyes. Lots of someones out in this world. What makes you think he's here? Rumor mill, mostly, the man said, stepping forward. Said a Mexican boy was seen limping across your field. Marjorie didn't flinch. Saw a coyote yesterday, if that helps. The other man laughed, low and hollow. You mind if we take a look inside? I do, actually. The first man stepped closer to the porch steps. Marjorie lifted the revolver into view. That's far enough. They stopped. The man in the jacket tipped his head. Didn't mean any trouble, ma'am. Well, you brought it. A long silence hung between them. The wind stirred the leaves along the fence line. We'll be back, the second man said finally. I'll be waiting. They turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back toward the road. Their truck's engine growled to life, but didn't rush off. It idled for a full minute before easing away into the dark. When Marjorie went back inside, Louise was standing in the kitchen, pale and stiff. They'll come back, he said. She nodded. Then we need a plan. Louise looked at her for a long time. You could let me go. I could, she said, but I won't. Outside, the wind picked up again, tossing the branches of the magnolia like restless arms. Inside, the two of them stood in a house not built for war, but suddenly made for resistance. And in the silence that followed, a decision took root, quiet and firm. If they came again, they would not find easy prey. They would find something far more dangerous. People who had nothing left to lose, except each other. The sun never truly warmed the earth that morning. It rose behind a veil of grey clouds, casting a cold light over Marjorie's porch and the frost-bitten grass below. Luis sat on the steps, his shoulders hunched against the wind, watching the road like he expected it to crack open and swallow them whole. Marjorie emerged with 2 mugs of tea and handed him one. He didn't say thank you this time. He just took it like it had become their language, the way they passed care between silences. "You sleep at all?" she asked, settling into her chair with a sigh. "A little," he said. "Not enough." They both knew why. The night before had carved a new kind of stillness into the house, one that hummed with tension even when nothing moved. Every creak in the floorboards had sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind had whispered threats they couldn't name. Luis turned toward her. "We need to go." Marjorie sipped her tea. "Go where?" "South. I know someone in New Mexico. He might help me get across the border. I can disappear again." She didn't answer, just stared at the horizon, her fingers tightening around the ceramic. "Staying puts you in danger," Luis said. "It's already too much." "That decision's mine to make," she replied, still not looking at him. Luis shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." Marjorie finally turned, her gaze sharp. "Maybe not, but I've spent too long doing nothing, sitting here with my grief, pretending it was enough to just survive. And maybe I owe something to myself." Luis didn't speak after that. Later that day, Marjorie called Pastor Green down in Dawsonville. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since James's funeral, but his voice hadn't changed. Still warm, still patient, still ready to help in a world that made helping feel harder by the year. "I need a favor," she said, "and I need your silence." He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. "I don't know much about immigration law," he said carefully, "but I know people who do, discreet ones." "Good," she said, "because we're running out of time." He promised to make some calls and get back to her within the next 2 days. After she hung up, she found Luis in the shed, sharpening a pair of rusted shears. "You any good with horses?" she asked. He glanced up, puzzled. "Not really." "Well, you're about to learn." They spent the afternoon prepping the old mare, Dusty, who hadn't been saddled in over a year. Marjorie cleaned the tack while Luis gathered feed and water. It wasn't much of an escape plan, but it was something, enough to get them moving fast if they had to. That evening, the air turned electric, the kind of stillness that came before a thunderstorm or a tragedy. Marjorie kept the lights low. She made chili, but neither of them ate much. Luis stood by the window, watching the darkness roll across the field like it meant to claim the house. "You ever shoot that gun?" he asked. Marjorie looked up from the table. "Yes." He nodded like that was both comforting and sad. "I'm not going back," he said suddenly. "I don't care who they send. I won't go back." She reached for the revolver and placed it on the table between them. "Then we make sure you don't have to." Just after midnight, headlights appeared at the top of the road. Not the sheriff's truck this time. These were darker, lower, creeping through the dust without urgency. The same men, or more of them. Marjorie didn't wait to find out. She moved through the house with practiced calm, locking the doors, turning off the last of the lamps, and motioning for Luis to get into position. They'd talked about this. The pantry had a back exit that led under the porch, and from there into the thicket behind the barn. She had packed a small bag, food, water, the revolver's extra rounds, and tucked it beside the door. If they knock, she'd told him, you run. What about you? He had asked. I'll buy you time. But now, with the truck idling just feet from her gate, the plan felt more like a prayer. A car door opened. Then another. Boots on gravel. Then the knock. 4 times, hard and impatient. Miss Bennett? One of them called. We know he's here. Marjorie opened the front door slowly, the screen creaking like an alarm. 2 men stood on her porch this time. The one in front wore a leather coat and a thin smile. The other was taller, heavier, his hand resting on the butt of his weapon. Evening, ma'am, the first one said. You've got something that doesn't belong to you. You're wrong about that, she replied. He stepped closer. We can do this polite, or we can do it fast. You want to come into my house, you'll have to step over me. The taller man moved, but the first one raised a hand to stop him. Lady, this isn't your fight. Marjorie's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. It is now. A noise behind them interrupted the standoff, a crashing sound from the barn. They turned, distracted just long enough. Luis burst from the shadows beside the porch and tackled the taller man to the ground. The gun went skittering across the porch. The other man lunged after Luis, but Marjorie raised her revolver and fired into the air. The sound cracked through the night like a thunderclap. Next one goes in somebody's leg, she shouted. The man froze, torn between rage and calculation. Luis scrambled to his feet, breathing hard, face streaked with blood from a shallow cut across his cheek. Run, Marjorie said. I'm not leaving you. Run! Luis hesitated for a heartbeat, then turned and sprinted toward the barn, disappearing into the darkness beyond. The men didn't follow. Not immediately. The leader looked at Marjorie, eyes full of something colder than hate. You just bought him a few hours, he said. That's all. She didn't answer. They backed off slowly, gathered their weapons, and returned to the truck. The engine roared to life and peeled away, the sound fading into the distance. Marjorie lowered the gun with trembling hands and sank into the porch chair, breath shallow. Inside, the house was still. Outside, the wind had picked up again. And somewhere in the trees, Luis was running for his life and maybe, finally, for a future that didn't end in fear. She prayed he'd make it, and that she'd be there, somehow, when he did. The last frost came late that year. Spring hadn't fully bloomed, but the mornings had softened. The sharp bite in the air had dulled to a cool whisper, and the magnolia tree outside Marjorie's porch had begun to bloom. Pale white flowers curled open like cautious prayers, reaching slowly toward the sun. She sat on the porch in the same wicker chair she'd used for decades, wrapped in James's old flannel, a blanket across her knees, and a cup of warm tea in her hands. It had been nearly 6 weeks since the men came, since Luis vanished into the trees with only a bag, a prayer, and a bruised heart, and she hadn't heard a word since. The sheriff came by once a few days after, asked vague questions, gave careful warnings, and left empty-handed. He hadn't returned. Neither had the strangers. The rumors had settled like ash in the town, still there, but no longer smouldering. Most folks had turned their curiosity elsewhere, but not Marjorie. She waited, not with desperation, not even with hope, just with knowing. She had spent too much of her life waiting for things to change, for people to return, for time to give her back what it had taken. But now she understood something deeper. Sometimes love didn't come back. Sometimes it moved forward. Sometimes it sent postcards. She reached for the mail that lay beside her tea and pulled out the newest envelope. The handwriting was crooked and careful. Inside was a folded page torn from a school notebook, the lines faint but neat. Miss Marjorie, we crossed into Arizona. Then, New Mexico. Pastor Green's contact helped me meet someone. They knew how to keep things quiet. There's a place now where no one looks too close. I clean stables. I sleep without dreaming. I eat more than I should. And I read every night like you told me to. The coat still smells like your porch. I keep it near the bed. I miss your tea. I miss your silence. Thank you for everything, for believing me when no one else did, for giving me a name again. I'll write more when it's safe. Until then, I'll be good. I'll be free. Louise. She pressed the letter against her chest, closing her eyes for a moment as the morning wind passed gently through the porch railings. She thought about the boy with too much sorrow in his eyes, the way he'd started sweeping the porch without being asked, the way he'd said her name like it meant something. And now he was gone. Not in the way James was gone, not in the way things disappear and leave nothing behind, but gone in the way a seed vanishes into earth and becomes something else, something growing, something alive. Later that day, Marjorie walked into town for the first time in months. She wore a long skirt and her gardening hat, waved to the clerk at the post office, picked up a new spool of thread from the general store. People looked at her a little longer than they used to, maybe wondering if the rumors were true, but no one said anything. And, if they did, she didn't hear it. She stopped at the bulletin board near the church and tacked up a flyer she'd written by hand. It read, "Free English lessons on Saturdays, for anyone who needs them. No questions asked." At the bottom, she had signed it simply, Marjorie B. The walk home was longer than it used to be, but she didn't mind the ache in her hips. The ache reminded her she was still here, still part of something. Back at the house, she swept the porch, refilled the bird feeder, and watered the tomato pots that Louise had insisted on planting, even though it had been too late in the season. A few green shoots had survived the frost. She smiled at them and left the sun to do the rest. That evening, as the sun melted behind the hills and the cicadas began their song, Marjorie brewed 2 cups of tea. She placed one beside her chair, just like always. And then she sat, staring out at the gravel road, at the magnolia tree blooming against all odds. She didn't expect him to return. She didn't need him to, because he'd already left what he needed to behind. His presence in the porch rails he sanded, in the garden beds he turned, in the quiet rooms that now held memory instead of dust, and because she had finally remembered how to live with someone again, even if they were no longer in the house. In the fading light, she reached for her knitting bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a half-finished scarf, soft, warm, dyed a dusty green. She ran her fingers over the stitches, then continued where she'd left off, the yarn slipping through her fingers like time. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, Marjorie Bennett kept knitting. For the boy who'd run, for the woman who'd stayed, and for all the things worth holding on to, even when you had to let them go.